What a terrifying introduction. Emma and Fedra and I are like feeling smaller and smaller the more you talk. Hi, nice to see you. It's warm, but hang in there. I will confess to a certain amount of anxiousness. I do talk in many situations all over the world, but I noticed a certain anxiety, which I think has got to do with, A, it's an inaugural event, so we obviously want this to go well. B, I'm talking about something I actually haven't spoken about in public before. Not because I'm ashamed of it, just but it didn't occur to me it might be helpful. So thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to do this. So without further ado, the feeling I most remember from that day back in 1979 is relief. Now, from the outside, there didn't seem to be a lot to be relieved about. There was an undergraduate being sped through the streets of Cambridge in an ambulance, covered in blood, bandages, sutures, a real mess. But inside, I promise you, relieved. I wasn't glad to be alive. That would come later. That took longer. I wasn't even feeling lucky, although I absolutely should have been, because had my friend Jane not followed a hunch and rang on my doorbell just as I was basically cutting my throat, it's unlikely I would have been here. And I wasn't feeling relief because I'd survived a suicide attempt, as it happens my second. One of the things that, at least my experience of depression, was your mind doesn't let you believe what's happening. And I don't think I realized how close I'd come to dying. I can remember standing there, my brain like taunting me, saying, no, you don't mean it, you don't mean it. And hence the mirror, standing in front of a mirror to try and see if this was real. I remember when we got to the hospital, I said this to the doctor there. I said, I'm not even sure I meant to do this. He said a very interesting thing. He said, well, serious or not, David, when you play with carving knives, accidents will happen. And true word. And it's certainly, if you looked at the ambulance, it looked like the accident had happened. But inside, I was relieved. And the reason I was relieved is because finally it was out there. It was out there. I had been feeling odd for a lot of my life, but there was no visible sign of that. I was a kind of a golden boy. Do you know, by the way, the definition of a genius? That is a child of average intelligence born into a Jewish family. And so I was, no expectation, right? Apparently it's the same with Indian. I don't know if there are any Indians here, but apparently it's a common feature. I was good at school. I was a really good musician. I was a people pleaser and a good-looking a kid. But so what if every so often I would have these nameless black periods that I couldn't find my way out of? So what if I had slit my wrists as a teenager? They said I thought too much. I was a romantic. So there was nothing to show for it and no words to describe it. Vocabulary was a difficult thing. There wasn't a word to describe how I was feeling. And I remember, I'm not a huge fan of the word depression, but I remember when I was about 8 or 9, I came across this word. And I read about this word depression. I thought, I kind of like that. That sounds like what I'm feeling. So I tried it on for size. I am depressed. Don't talk to me, I'm depressed. And this worked until my cleaner, we had a cleaner, Mrs. Mooney, who was a stick-thin Glaswegian woman. She put paid to that by saying, depression isn't for the children. I can't do the Glaswegian accent, but it's not for children. You have to grow up to be depressed. I thought, well, there's something to look forward to. But the funny thing was, if people don't see anything, there was no visible sign of it, you stop seeing it yourself, right? You stop seeing it yourself. You start to explain it away. I mean, not everybody didn't see it. Some people did see through the mask, and often they were people who had felt it themselves. Now, I remember a couple of weeks before Suicide Day, I was sitting on a bench in Cambridge, being, politely, covertly depressed, middle-class depression. I was feeling very depressed, but not showing it. And I noticed some guys larking about. I think in the 70s we called them like tramps. That was the name of it, winos or whatever. But these were rough sleepers, effectively, and they were like horsing about. And I see them, they see me, they stop their horsing around, and they start to approach. So I'm feeling in my pockets for some change, thinking, you know, they need money. And they say to me, are you okay? We've got a place to sleep. Do you want to join us? And it was a shock. They didn't want money. They wanted to help. So they had seen me. And they could see the danger I was sailing into, even though I couldn't. And so there we were in the ambulance, December the 3rd, 1979, and I was feeling incredible relief, because finally it was well and truly out there, right? The hospital they took me to is called Fulbourn. I checked, it's still there, and it was... it's a psychiatric hospital just outside Cambridge, and it's very, you know, wonderful. Interesting, it was a wonderful experience, and not what you expect to hear about a psychiatric hospital. It was wonderful for lots of reasons. Is there somebody who could bring me some water? And it's partly anxiety, but partly also just the lights and the stuff, so it'd be really good. Oh, there's water there. Look at that. It's magic. Oh, thank you. There's coconut water. It's like, I'm not going to do the salute to the sun, but I will have some water. Thank you. So thank you. What made Fulbourn wonderful, first and foremost, was that it was full of people who also, it was out there. Their lives had come to bits, and it was out there. There was nothing to hide. And I learned this on the first morning. I was woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning by the doctor doing her rounds, except she wasn't the doctor. She was a patient who thought she was a doctor doing her rounds. And I remember waking up and kind of getting a little bit arsy, and I was about to give her a piece of my mind, and I look across at another bed, and there's a guy whose name's turned out to be David as well. And he gives me this look, and the look says, what do you care? If she wants to be a doctor, let her be a doctor, right? What else are you going to do with your day? And it was true. It was a wonderfully freeing feeling. You want to be the doctor, you be the doctor. It's fine. The other wonderful thing about Fulbourn was there was nothing much to do. And they had these amazing baths, these long Victorian baths, and I love baths, I still do, and I would sit there and I would soak and enjoy that. But the most amazing thing about Fulbourn for me was right in the middle of the day room was a tuned grand piano. Don't know why, go figure. And I should explain that from the age of about 5 or 6, I'd been a piano player. When I was 9, I was singing, I was a soloist at the Royal Opera House, and I made records, you know, with Domingo and other people like that, and I'd played in orchestras all over the world. So I was like a performer. I was much more a performer than an undergraduate. And for me, normally, a piano would have said performance, right? And for those of us who are performers, performance equals anxiety. It would have meant, you know, am I good enough? Do they like me? Did I sing well enough? And the audience was a bit like you. I thought of the audience as people out in the dark, you know, judging you from a distance. But at Fulbourn, it was different. At Fulbourn, I just sang. I sang day in, day out. I sang Neapolitan love songs. And people used to come in and go out, and I just sang. I remember there was one woman, her name was Chrissy, and she had been brought in really like crazy a few days before, and then she was just left to sit. And she would sit and she would unwind, really. And I would sing something like this. Partirono le rondini dal mio paese freddo e senza sole, cercando primavera da viole, nidi d'amore di felicità. La mia piccola rondine partì, sempre lasciarmi un bacio, senza un addio partì. Stuff like that. Thanks. And there was something about that, looking back for this speech, I was thinking, there's something about that moment that had all the seeds for everything I've really done since, the stuff I've done in business and stuff I've done in the NGO space. And for me, it was things like, when things get really dark, they also get very bright. They can. When you can't say things, sometimes music can connect people in ways that words won't. That when you stop pretending, things can get really interesting. That magical stuff can happen even in the most difficult or odd circumstances. And that sometimes when you don't know what to do, you're forced to consider why you do what you do. I stayed in the psychiatric hospital for about a month, but before I left, I organized a Christmas party. And I remember it was great. We had an enormous sign which said, "Happy Christmas, Loonies." But we pasted it up so it looked outwards. So as people are driving past in the cars. But there was a point, because actually when you were in a hospital like this, you went outside, honestly, the outside world seemed way madder than what was going on inside the psychiatric hospital, where everyone was just like, it was out there, right? Still, that's the world I went back out into after Fullborn. And if you look at my CV, that episode looks like a kind of blip. I went back to Cambridge, thanks to their understanding. I didn't do very much work, but they had me back, and also my teacher was very kind, and I lodged with him and his wife. Also, extremely lucky that a man called Stanley Kubrick, who some of you will know, was a film director. He gave me a job. So I had a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and it was, I honor him for doing that. And then after university, I was, you look at the CV, it says advertising by day, opera singing at night. I set up an opera company, Opera Circus. Then I have a BBC TV show about music, and a big company, one of the biggest consultancies in the world, the biggest consultancy in the world. I can't say their name because they'll find me and hunt me down. But they saw me, they invited me in because they wanted to talk about how you might use music to solve problems differently and connect as people in ways we wouldn't have imagined possible, was their brief. And that kicked off a whole 20 years of working in the business world, personal, professional development, leadership, using the arts and other techniques. And then more recently, Impropera, an improvised opera company, and very recently, Street Wisdom, which is a kind of inspirational non-profit that I'm running with some people in this room. Mel, where are you? She's around, yeah. We're out there giving inspiration workshops on the streets, free. And I'm allowed to say free? Yeah, we don't pay fees, we pay attention. If you look on my website, you'll see this stuff, and you'll see that I'm an innovator in business and the arts and social change. You'll see I'm a creative confidant to business leaders and so on and so forth. But that's the front stage me. That's the on stage me. What you don't see, and what I don't often talk about, in fact, this is kind of the first time, is the backstage. What's in the backstage? And in the backstage, it's 10 years of therapy 3 times a week. There's working on self-development courses. I've hugged every tree from here to, I've done multi-personality work, past life work, meditations in temples. I have a psychic coach on my speed dial and so on and so forth. And this might look like laudable self-development, but it wasn't, in honesty. It was me digging myself out of the difficulty over the years and learning to kind of come to terms with the fact that darkness is part of wholeness, and gradually learning to incorporate this, this feeling into my life. That was my university, and everything I've learned in temples and rehearsal rooms and stuff, I've now shared, and I do share with people, including in the business world. To do that in the business world, and there are many of you here in the business world, you'll know that I needed to become a good translator. Because frankly, if I'm going to bring this stuff into the business world, I have to do it in a way that I'm not going to look too, let's face it, weird, right? So I became good at translating this stuff into terms that people from a very different mindset would see and understand and be able to make sense of. But I realized again, as a result of this talk, really, that I had been becoming covert again. And the reason for that is things like depression are still really taboo in the workplace. It's not something you can talk about. And that's one of the reasons I'm working with, where's Jeff? Jeff and Camilla, and George isn't here, but Minds at Work. And also one of the reasons that I'm working here with Nancy. Because my concern is not far from this room, or maybe even in it, there's somebody who feels life isn't worth living and feels like they're the only one who ever felt that way and feels like they can't talk about it, which is the most dangerous feeling of all. So I came here to be helpful. And finally, I'd just like to say a word about being helpful. I was trying to think what would be helpful. Would it be helpful, for example, if I took what I knew now, traveled back in time to that guy sitting in the back of the ambulance, the guy who didn't want to live? Would it be helpful sharing that with him? And if I'm really honest, I don't think so. When you're depressed, profoundly depressed, as Nancy was saying, the last thing you want is someone, especially your alter ego, coming and telling you, it's all going to be fine in the end, yeah? It doesn't matter if they're right. In fact, it's worse if they're right, because something in your head says, yeah, but you don't understand actually what a mess up I really am. But if that person were to time travel to here and see us here now, would that help? And I actually thought it would. I thought he would be pleased to see us here together. I think he'd be happy I'm still singing. I can still sing. I think he'd be amused that I turned what nearly stopped him living into how I make my living. I think he'd be chuffed that I'm talking about our story as it happens like for the first time in public. But most of all, I think he'd be relieved because now it's well and truly out there. Thank you.